Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the It Depends podcast. I am your host. My name is Kevin Goldsmith. I am a chief technology officer, but I've been working in tech for over 30 years as a developer, senior developer, architect, lead, engineering manager, senior engineering manager, director, VP, and now CTO. And it is my pleasure every episode to bring you a chapter from the audiobook of It Depends, Writing on Technology Leadership 2012 to 2022, a book I wrote and published this year, 2024, in March, published by Unit Circle Press. If you're interested in the book, if you'd like to purchase it, you can find more information at itdependsbook.net. There's also a newsletter. The newsletter comes out every other week. So the podcast comes out every other week. So they alternate. And every newsletter article is also a chapter from the book. And it is different than the podcast. So if you subscribe to both, you get different chapters every week. And of course, we're now halfway through, or more than halfway through, the book on both of them. So things that I've done in the newsletter, I'm now doing in the podcast, and vice versa. When I do that, I always try and link out so you can get the either written or audio version of the chapter if you want. But of course, if you're getting value from the book and you want to get it all at once, please feel free to buy it. This week's chapter is part 4 of the series on writing and delivering performance reviews. So this is the last part of that series. Hopefully you're getting it long before it's time to do your performance reviews if you do sort of end of the year reviews. If it's early, save these episodes, come back to them later, listen to them again right before you start doing the reviews. But of course, if you listen to all 4 parts, you know one of the things I talk about to make the reviews go faster and a little bit easier is to be accumulating data throughout the year. So hopefully, if you've been listening to these episodes, you've started to do that already, and that'll make your life a lot easier when performance review time comes. I was thinking about this chapter and trying to decide what extra information I could give to it on this chapter on actually delivering the performance review. And it was a little tough for me, to be honest. Having reread the chapter to prepare for the podcast, and thinking, okay, what did I miss? Or is there some sort of personal anecdote I want to share? And yeah, I mean, certainly I've had, I'm not going to talk about experiences for other people's performances reviews that I've done because I don't want to do that. If somebody out there is actually listening, goes, that was me, I don't want to talk about them. But I was thinking about performance reviews I'd received. And one of the things I'll say is that when you get to a senior level, and for me, that's been pretty much since I became a VP. So now going back over 10 years, I haven't really had a performance review since then. And I talked about this a little bit in a talk I gave at the Leading Edge conference in London in 2022. And I thought this might actually be an interesting thing to add, especially because this is a bit shorter of a chapter. And I can kind of not summarize that talk, but at least reference a talk, give you a little bit of insight, especially if you're not at this level. If you're not currently a VP or CTO, if you're not reporting to a C-level person, basically. Because that's been the thing, is since I've started reporting to a C-level person, I haven't had a real performance review. It doesn't mean I haven't gotten feedback from my boss, usually the CEO, but it's just, I think, an artifact of being at that level. I think it's also an artifact that I work in startups, larger startups, several hundred people startups. I would imagine this would be the case, or it was the case when I was at early stage startups as well. And it is that even if you have an established performance review practice, you don't quite get them at the C level. I think the general assumption is maybe the CEO's too busy to actually do the process, or they just expect you to know how you're doing. You don't get a lot of feedback generally at the C level unless you screw up. If you do well, you'll get a, hey, good job or good catch or something like that. It's not that you never hear any feedback at all. Sometimes from the board, and I've definitely seen my peers get very direct board feedback where they lost their jobs because of a bad board meeting, a bad presentation to the board. That was sort of they didn't realize this was like a final straw. But it's just an artifact of being at this level. And that talk, the talk I gave, was very much about how you, as a senior leader, where you're not getting a ton of feedback, you're just expected to do the job and you're expected to know how you're doing yourself. How do you continue to develop, right? So in this series, we're talking about you as lead or engineering manager or director or VP or CTO giving performance feedback to your direct reports. And you should absolutely give very good performance feedback to them. What happens when you don't get that feedback? And not in the context of how you give it to other people or anything like that. Just what do you do? How do you know how you're doing? How do you measure your own performance? And also, how do you improve if no one's giving you any kind of, hey, you should do this more, you should do that more. And also to say, like, I've had CTOs that give me really good advice about how to be better, but it's usually very direct, very specific to a situation. Like, I did something and I got feedback from the CEO, hey, next time maybe do this way. And it was good advice, but it wasn't, I'd like to see more of this. So what you have to do, you can ask for feedback. Absolutely. And you'll get some, not always actionable, not always helpful, but some. If you have a really good boss, maybe they'll give you more extended feedback. But how do you improve? Because I'm not done. I'm not perfect. Believe me, there's a lot of things I know I could be doing better than I do. If you're not getting that feedback from your manager, and by the way, this is helpful feedback to any of you, no matter what level you are. If your boss is just not really good at doing performance reviews, please send them these podcasts or the newsletters or buy them the book. But if they're not good at doing this or they don't care about it, but you want to be better, you want to improve their help or not, how do you do that? The way I've done it for years now, one, I look very directly to the people that work for me and I try to get feedback from them. How could I be better for you? How could I be a better manager to you? And sometimes I ask that in a very direct way, and sometimes I ask it in a little bit less of a direct way, trying to elicit different ideas or different feedback from different people, or look for other things that give me a sign about things I could do better. I used to send to my entire organization or just have it as in the email signature. I had a form, an anonymous form that anybody with a link could give me feedback. And it felt good. I never really got much useful feedback from it, honestly. So I haven't kept up that practice. I still like the idea, but I just never got any useful feedback from it. So it didn't really help that much. And maybe in a different organization, maybe I should try it again. Maybe with a different organization, I might get better feedback. Getting feedback from the people that report to you, because they're the ones who are maybe interacting with you more regularly. They may not have good advice to give you, but they could tell you how the impact of your decisions or the way you're working affects them, which could give you some ideas. I spend a lot of time talking to peers. That is incredibly helpful. So I have peers at other companies, friends I've come up with. Some of them are mentioned in the book. Some of them wrote blurbs for the book. And they're I've seen this described lots of different ways, but essentially they're my personal board of directors is what I called it. It's a group of people who I can ask advice from, I have full trust with, and I can get answers from if I'm having a problem. They can do the same with me, and they know me. So that's helpful, and I know them, and so I can understand the context when they give me advice. And that's a group I've kind of very consciously curated over the years. And it's not like I have weekly one-on-ones with them or anything, but periodically I come to a decision point or I need help with something, I will reach out to that group. And I've found that advice incredibly helpful and useful. So finding those peers that can give you feedback. If you can find them when you work with them who can give you feedback, that's even better. Unfortunately, at the C-level, the problem is my peers, who I very much respect and like a lot and trust, they don't know my job. They don't understand my job. That's the thing at the C-level is like the VP of marketing is not going to be able to tell me how I could be managing my team better. She's not a CTO. She doesn't have the same context I do. She doesn't understand the challenges, just like I wouldn't necessarily have very good advice for how she should run her team. And I don't see as much into her team, that kind of thing. But if you're at the director level, where you have a peer that you work with or your teams work together, that's a great person, or a VP. At Spotify, no offense to the Spotify CTO, not great on giving feedback. It's not a skill, but my peers, amazing. I got tremendous feedback from my peers. It helped me improve so much better. And just that group, still, those are the people, they're very much in that personal board of directors. If I have a problem, if I have a challenge, if I'm not sure how to approach something, those are the people I talk to. So that's helpful. That's one way that you can continue to improve. You can get outside input. I am also try to be very introspective. You hear me, if you've been listening to the podcast or reading the newsletter or read the book, talk a lot about being deliberate. I write a lot, not necessarily journal, but I write a lot. I write my way through things. That includes sometimes the articles I wrote that ended up being the matter of the book. That helps because that process of writing it down lets you step away a little bit, lets you think about it. I do have a regular kind of personal retrospective process that helps me think about how I'm approaching things, the challenges I'm having, think about ways I could have maybe solved something in a more helpful way or a better way, give myself things to think about for the future, find books to read. Goodreads is great. If you follow good people, you can follow me on Goodreads. You'll see what I'm reading. And I have a collection of books that are what I call, I think, business books, but it's basically, there's a lot of leadership books in there, for example. And I follow people who read great stuff. And if I read what they read, what they like, I always learn something. So that's also another thing to kind of curate, if you're a reader, the things other people read and get recommendations that way. So personal introspection, building a peer group that can help you, especially if you work with them today and you trust their input. Another way that I find new ways to learn or new areas to learn is attending conferences. If you're not a reader, attending conferences might be helpful. You can get different perspectives on your job from other people doing it at other companies. Also a really good way to find that sort of personal advisory board, personal board of directors. You don't even have to attend a conference necessarily. You can there's videos of everything on YouTube or various places now. In fact, you can find tons of my videos, talks I've given on YouTube. A lot of that content later turned into the chapters of the book, or will someday turn into the next book. There's the RAND Slack. If you don't know what I'm talking about, RAND's Leadership Slack. That's a Slack channel. That's a massive Slack channel of engineering managers derived from the RANDs and Repos blog. Michael Lopp, he's written some good engineering leadership books himself. That's a good reference and a good way to sort of find people or get advice. but it's a really big group. These paid for kind of circle groups can be very beneficial. Some of them include mentoring. I actually mentor with one officially. I have an official mentorship kind of role with that group. And that's can be very, very helpful. The challenge with these groups, I have found for me personally, is generally they're priced assuming your company is going to pay for it. And if your company is willing to pay for it, awesome. If you're the one footing the bill, they can be quite expensive. And for that reason, I hesitate to recommend them because of that. If your company is willing to pay for it as a mentorship or coaching for you, that's awesome. They can be exceptionally helpful. A lot of people I know have really benefited from it. But if you're footing the bill yourself, like for me, the expense doesn't make sense for me. And I also haven't really felt comfortable asking a company to pay for it. But that's also me. Your company and you might be different. So all these different ways are how I kind of work around just not getting particularly useful or direct feedback from a CEO or when I was a VP from a CTO. If you're lucky enough to have somebody that gives you great advice as a manager, that's excellent. But you should always be prepared for the fact that your next manager, either at your next company or when your manager moves on or whatever, may not be good at it. So it's good to start building these practices, building the introspection practices. It'll also help you be more engaged in your own development with your manager because you're thinking about it more, which helps you ask better questions, ask for better advice, things like that. Same thing with that personal advisory board, that group of peers that you can trust and you can ask questions of who can give you feedback. Same thing, that introspection process helps with it. If you can get your job to pay for a group or you feel okay footing that bill yourself, finding that even one of those kind of professional mentoring groups, those can be very useful as well. The free ones also useful. Usually it's a little bit more one-to-many than that small group though, but that's okay. If you're comfortable with that or you prefer that free group kind of idea. And then looking at videos or reading books and doing all these kinds of things just to keep yourself growing. I've just found the more senior you are, the harder it is to get that feedback. And again, partially it is also when you are at the C level, your boss probably doesn't understand your job. I mean, they do. They understand leadership, hopefully, but they don't necessarily understand your job. So your boss, if you're a CTO or a VP reporting to a CEO, it's unlikely, not always, but it's often unlikely that they came from technology. They might have come from sales or operations or some other part of the company. And so they don't quite understand what you do, which is also makes it hard to get a lot of help, direct feedback from them, unless you did something obviously wrong. And that's just okay. Like that's going to have to be okay. You can get useful advice from them, but you just can't assume it, right? And to be clear, like no shade on anybody I've ever worked for. I've worked for some really awesome CEOs that have taught me a lot. But if I'm thinking back to when I was an engineering manager, some of the people I reported to when I was still kind of working my way up that management ladder, those people were incredibly transformative to how I think about this role, to how I got to where I am. And since getting to that C-level role, I've gotten better at it thanks to feedback from CEOs. It's just not, I've had to do a little bit more of the work on my own, which is appropriate. But it's something you should be aware of if you are either at that C-level or you're hoping to get to that C-level, and then you get your first CTO job or CIO or CISO or chief data officer role, wherever you are. And all of a sudden you're like, how do I know if I'm doing a good job? And why am I not getting career advice? And what am I supposed to do from here? That just doesn't happen. You're expected to work that out on your own. Anyway, so that digression aside, like I said, I just couldn't think of anything in particular. Like, I have tons of great stories about performance reviews I've done that have gone well or gone poorly, but I don't feel comfortable sharing those because obviously there's another person involved in that who may or may not appreciate me telling that story. And I do have stories of my own performance reviews, which I'm very comfortable to tell, but nothing particularly that I don't already talk about in the chapter. Just a lot of crummy performance reviews from people. And like a specific story, whatever. Nothing amazing to talk about there. That said, here is chapter 22 of It Depends, Writing on Technology Leadership 2012 to 2022, Writing Useful Performance Reviews, Delivering the Review. Writing Useful Performance Reviews, Delivering the Review. Originally published on January 20th, 2022. Each review discussion is one of the most important meetings in a person's professional life. The primary goal of the meeting is a milestone in a career journey. You will give the person an understanding of the progress they have made and insight into how they can get to the next stage of their career. All the work preparing and writing the performance appraisal can go to waste by delivering the review poorly. I have always found the review conversation the most nerve-wracking for me as a manager, because that is when you see the effect of your, hopefully, well-considered analysis on the person. And people are people. The conversation is always a bit awkward, given the stakes for the person receiving the review. But from there, it can go in many unexpected directions. I've had tense, combative conversations with people receiving a very positive review. Conversely, I've had a very unexpectedly genial and optimistic conversation with someone accepting a poor review. Even if you know the person well, the review conversation can be challenging. Common advice is to give precise feedback to the people who report to you frequently during the year. If you do this, the review itself should not surprise them, as it would be consistent with what you have already said. However, while someone may have heard the feedback, it is another thing to see it written on a piece of paper with a review score, if your organization does that, and a salary adjustment connected to that feedback. Even if you are confident that nothing written in the review is new information, the person receiving it may not feel that way. The best method I've found for having these discussions go smoothly is to come to the meeting prepared, give the person time to digest the review before the dialogue, and structure the conversation itself. Preparing for the discussion. If you have followed the spirit of the process in the previous articles, you have assembled, organized, and interpreted a lot of data to write the review. This data is also helpful for your preparation and during the conversation itself. Having the information to explain things further if there are questions or disagreements is valuable. Their memory or interpretation of events is sometimes very different than yours or that of their peers. Read over their review again. Make sure you have the data at hand to support the evaluation you wrote in case there are questions. If you think the discussion might be tense, you may even want to rehearse the conversation in advance with another dev manager or someone from your company's HR team. I sometimes rehearse challenging messages in the shower, looking for the right way to say something. You may also prepare positive messages to find the best way to say something without ambiguity. Have empathy for the person receiving the review. Think of the performance reviews you have received during your career, both the good and the bad. What made them stand out to you? Was it the review itself, or the discussion or lack thereof? While the anticipation and initial excitement of the evaluation are finding out about a promotion, raise, or bonus, and knowing that your hard work was recognized, the thing you will remember long after was the delivery of the information and the discussion that followed. I have received at least 50 reviews since I started working. I don't remember the numbers or most of the review scores. Still, I remember the manager who hadn't put any thought into the process, the one who made promises review after review that they never kept, and the assessment where a manager made statements that were demonstrably false, and when shown evidence to the contrary, threw up their hands. I also remember the great conversations I had with the best managers I worked for that made me proud of what I had accomplished and excited about what more I could do and how they would help me. While you may be nervous about the conversation, the person you speak to is even more so. For you, it is the conversation that is scary. For them, it is the implications of the discussion on their livelihood. So come to the dialogue with that understanding and empathy for their position. Give the person their review to read beforehand. There is always the question of when to let the person read the actual document. Over the years, I've tried it 3 different ways. Handing the person the review after sitting down to the discussion and letting them read it before speaking. At the end of the review conversation to read afterward. Giving the assessment to them the day before or the morning of the conversation. The method that seems to work best is to give the person the assessment to review several hours before the review discussion, saving the actual numbers for the conversation. When you give the person time to read and process the review document before the meeting, it allows them to prepare for the meeting. It takes some of the person's concerns away because they know what to expect in the conversation itself, which makes the conversation less stressful for them. If they disagree with the assessment, it gives them time to prepare any argument or evidence they wish to present, making it feel less like an ambush. By sharing the review in advance, I've found that the conversation itself is often more substantive and valuable. The review discussion. Start with a brief introduction. While you both know why you are here, it is good to start the discussion with some of the broader context around the review process and anything around the company's performance that will be relevant to the meeting, like a limited raise budget in a tough economic year. But unfortunately, that broader context often gets lost in the review conversation itself, which can lead to confusion or misunderstandings. Don't bury the lead. If you have given the document to the person in advance, they will join the meeting with an idea of what to expect in the conversation. However, they will still be wondering about the salary numbers. While you may be talking about other things, until the person knows what their salary change is, they will still wonder about it. To make the conversation more valuable, I like to share the salary change information or promotion early in the conversation. Once the person knows the most critical information they will receive, they can focus on the more extensive discussion about career development. Discuss the document. Discuss each section in the assignment together to make sure that there is a common understanding and agreement. Now is when you might share more details or data around your statements if needed. Do not just ask, "Do you agree with this section?" Instead, make sure they understand your comments, that you have answered any questions they have, and that they either concur with your assessment or at least appreciate your perspective and the data behind your conclusions. Where to go from here? If the review conversation is a checkpoint along a career, it is essential to help the person understand where the next checkpoint could be. It is vital in the review conversation to talk to the future and reflect on the past. Now is an excellent opportunity to give hope and support to someone who had a problematic review cycle or inspire someone who has been doing well to achieve even bigger goals. Hopefully, you have been having regular discussions about the person's career aspirations. The review discussion is the right time to confirm their goals and discuss how you can help them achieve them. What opportunities can you present to them that will help them grow professionally between this discussion and the next review discussion? Be very careful about making promises that you can't keep. There are many things beyond your control in the review process, like the raise budget, the stock pool, company performance, global economic situations, or a final promotions approval. Even if you had all those things within your control now, you might move on to a new role or a new company by the time of the following review. If you make a promise and cannot keep it, you will demoralize the person and lose their trust. So choose your words carefully when talking about the future. After the discussion. Within a few days of the discussion, write the person a note confirming any statements from the conversation, the answers to any questions you didn't have during the dialogue, and the agreed upon growth path. If you have a shared agenda for your one-on-ones or a list of topics to discuss, make sure that you regularly review any growth plans by adding them as a discussion topic. Problem scenarios. What if the person disagrees with my assessment? From time to time, someone will decide that your interpretation of the data is incorrect, and therefore your review is wrong. When this happens, go over the person's data you collected for the appraisal. If they have some information you didn't receive in the process that causes you to reconsider, don't promise them that you will change the review. Investigate the new information, and if you want to change things, discuss it with your manager. This kind of late change rarely happens, however. If they continue to refuse to accept your assessment, invite them to sit down with you, your manager, and a person from the people team to discuss it. You want the person's concerns heard, but if they don't have any new data, you also want someone in the conversation who will support you. What if they want to negotiate a different raise? People will occasionally believe that the salary discussion is a negotiation. I have heard that this is common in a few cultures, but is generally not done that way. As I discussed in the previous chapter, the person's new salary is arrived at as part of a long process, and there isn't much, if any, flexibility by the time you deliver the review to the person. You generally can't change their salary autonomously, so if you agree to reconsider and then you can't change the number, you look ineffectual as their manager. Also, changing their salary will encourage others to try and negotiate in their salary review discussion. The word always gets around when something like this happens. If someone is unhappy with their raise, discuss what they could do during the next review period to justify making a more significant raise recommendation. But once again, don't promise anything. If someone was expecting an entirely unrealistic raise, you might want to share with them a bit about how the salary review process works and help them understand what normal looks like. What if their friends at other companies got much bigger raises? Occasionally, in the salary review discussion, someone will tell you about their friend who got a 50% raise. They will also tell you about an article they read that says many companies are giving considerable raises to retain employees. Given how charged salaries are as a subject, and how competitive the technology is for good talent, much disinformation about salaries is constantly circulating. When faced with these stories, it is worth discussing your company's salary benchmarking process. Help the person understand that there will always be outliers and unusual situations, but express that those are the exceptions and not the norm. It is also worth discussing the non-salary aspects of your company that make it an exciting place to work. Companies often look to salary as their only employee retention tool when it is hard to retain employees because of their culture, lack of growth opportunities, or uninteresting projects. If you've been regularly giving feedback, you've prepared for writing the review, and you've prepared for the review conversation, it will almost always go well. In this chapter, I talk about the many ways the review discussion can go wrong because that can make the whole process scary for many people. It is good to be prepared for the conversation to go in a challenging direction. However, if you've been open with people about their performance and regularly given them feedback, and you talk to them about how you will help them improve in their performance, the tough conversations are few and far between. I usually end the performance review process proud of what each person has achieved and excited about helping them reach their potential. That is my hope for you as well. Hopefully that chapter was helpful. Hopefully this series was helpful. If you have questions, if you have comments, please write me contact@itdependsbook.net. Let me know what you're thinking. Let me know if something's been helpful. Let me know if you have a question. I'm happy to answer it. In fact, as we're now on the second half of the book, we have 16 more chapters to go. I'm starting to think about what is going to happen when I'm done, if I'm going to continue or not continue, or how I'm going to continue, things like that. I would love to hear from you at some point soon. I keep meaning I'm going to do it, send out a survey, and I'll link that from show notes when I have it, and I'll tell you about it on the podcast to get some ideas from you all. But if you have questions, that might be helpful for me to think about topics to cover after after we finish the book for maybe the beginning of a second season of this podcast. Thanks to those of you who've been sharing the podcast, who've been listening. The numbers of downloads go up every episode. That is extremely gratifying. And I'm hoping that me sharing this knowledge is being helpful to those of you who are on the technology management career ladder or thinking about someday joining that career ladder. If you haven't signed up for the newsletter, please do that as well. Obviously, that ends up being a bit of a shorter thing because I'm already including the chapter, so there's not as much backstory in that. I kind of leave that for here. But if you want a more direct, just give me the chapter with a minimum of fluff, that's that experience. I tried to differentiate these two experiences a little bit. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you in a couple weeks on the podcast. I'll see you next week in the newsletter. Thanks so much for listening. Please, again, subscribe, rate, share episodes of this podcast on your favorite podcast app. Thank you for Answers to April for the music used in this podcast. To hear more from Answers to April, visit answerstoapril.com. This podcast is a production of Unit Circle Media.